Good afternoon. I'm Morgan Smiley. I'm a sophomore in Trumbull College, and I'm the Deputy Operations Director for the William F. Buckley Jr. Program. This afternoon, we're honored to have with us Roger Kimball, moderating on the topic Life and Political Thought of James Burnham in History. Mr. Kimball is the editor and publisher of The New Criterion and the president and publisher of Encounter Books. He is a widely acclaimed author, particularly well known for his book, Tenured Radicals: How Politics Has Corrupted Higher Education, and for his most recent book, The Fortunes of Permanence, Culture and Anarchy in the Age of Amnesia. As a frequent contributor to many publications, including National Review, The Wall Street Journal, and Literary Review, and as a board member of the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, Mr. Kimball also finds time to serve as the chairman of the board of directors for the William F. Buckley Jr. Program. We are very grateful to have him here today. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Roger Kimball.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. If I were asked to name the most important political philosopher of the 20th century, James Burnham would certainly come at the very top of my short list. Now that might seem odd because I suspect that outside this room and the corridors of National Review, Burnham has slipped into that tenebrous oubliette of reputational exile that public opinion reserves for people who contest the established orthodoxy too vigorously. If you consult Amazon, Amazon.com, you will find that all of his books, with one exception, are either out of print or of, quote, limited availability, that is, more limited than available. Yet, as Don Kagan said, Bill Buckley described Burnham as the foremost intellectual influence on National Review from its founding in 1955, when Burnham helped Bill start that great magazine. Don also mentioned The Managerial Revolution, probably his best-known book, published in 1941, just as he was negotiating that perilous journey that Don adumbrated from Trotskyist infatuation to an astringent species of democratic realism. Today, I think, Burnham is best known, to the extent that he's known at all, as an anti-communist crusader. And he was that. But he did not confine his criticism to communism, far from it. On the contrary, he understood that the impulse to totalitarian surrender comes in all manner of guises. And that is part of what underwrites his contemporary relevance, part of what makes it so pertinent that we are celebrating him here today. The Managerial Revolution that aimed to repel freedom for the sake of bureaucratic efficiency and control, that was Burnham's real subject. That revolution has not yet, not quite, succeeded in establishing the monolithic control that Burnham envisioned and feared, or that George Orwell, who referred often to the Managerial Revolution, he wrote about it several times, and it was a major inspiration for his novel 1984. That hasn't quite come to pass. But I think as we gaze around the world today, here in America and elsewhere, we can see that the increasing routinization of life, the increasing bureaucratization of life, shows that Burnham was on to something very important. Over his long career, Burnham obviously changed his mind about a lot of things. To go from Leon Trotsky to Bill Buckley, after all, is quite a leap. But one thing that never wavered was his commitment to freedom. He was mistaken as a youth when he thought that freedom might be found in communist revolution. But that's why he supported it. After he underwent his process of political maturation, he had a better understanding of what freedom really consisted in, and he devoted his career to fostering it. Now, this commitment to freedom, I think, had two sides for Burnham. There was the infrequently visible side of celebration when freedom's genuine triumphs were on view. And there was an oppositional side, which he lavished with cordial hostility on those opinions, policies, sentiments, and personalities that worked to stymie freedom. This dual commitment made Burnham an equal opportunity scourge. He was almost as hard on what Tocqueville called the democratic despotism, that tendencies of democracies to barter freedom for the sake of equality, even if it was only a spurious equality, as he was on communism. Burnham was a connoisseur of insidiousness, of the way that benign or seemingly benign intentions can be enlisted to promulgate malevolent, illiberal policies. He described this process as accurately in Western democracies as he did in communist tyrannies, and he was tireless in his excoriation of what he called, and I quote, that jellyfish brand of contemporary liberalism, pious, guilt-ridden, do-goody, which uses the curious dogma of some truth on both sides as its perpetual sales line. That's pretty good. Burnham's biographer, Daniel Kelly, observed that Burnham was, quote, the living embodiment of what would be later called political correctness. Kelly was right. Consider, to take just one example, Burnham's observation that most African nations were really, quote, half-formed pseudo-nations. Now, as then, that is indisputably the case. But how many accredited intellectuals have the forthrightness or the courage to apprise Robert Mugabe, for example, of that inconsiderate fact? Burnham was refreshing on many subjects, not least the United Nations and its disapproving resolutions about U.S. policy. Why in the world, he wondered, should any sensible person give a damn what some spokesman for cannibalistic tribes or slave-holding nomads thinks about nuclear tests? I think that's a pretty good question. Now, it would be easy to multiply such crisp interventions. Nevertheless, I hesitate to apply the label politically incorrect to so insightful and spirited a critic as James Burnham. In many quarters, calling someone politically incorrect has become a popular method of discounting his opinions without the inconvenience of allowing them a hearing. It is a clever, if cowardly, rhetorical trick. It allows you to ignore someone by the simple expedient of declaring his arguments to be beyond the pale, extreme, that is, unworthy of a place in the forum of polite debate. At bottom, the procedure is a form of political ostracism. The goal is to silence someone not by forbidding him to speak, but by denying him an audience. The technique is especially effective with writers like Burnham, who specialize in telling truths that most people would rather not hear. Now, today, we are gathered to discuss what I think is one of Burnham's most important books, Suicide of the West, which he described in his subtitle. Actually, it has two separate subtitles. The one that we printed is an essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism, but Don referred to the other subtitle, which has the pathology of liberalism, but it's both the destiny and pathology of liberalism. I suppose they come to more or less the same thing. I'm pleased that Encounter Books together with Lauren Noble and the Buckley program, was able to publish this new edition. It's hot off the press. I'm not sure if it's even officially published yet, but it can be yours for a very modest consideration. It's possible that Lauren is even, in her largesse, distributing copies for free. I'm not sure about that. I don't want to commit her to that. But we're delighted to be able to publish that on the 50th anniversary of the book. At the center of Burnham's argument in this book is a recognition that civilizations tend to die from suicide, not foreign imposition. This is something that Arnold Toynbee, the historian, understood. He said more or less the same thing, as indeed did Lincoln. If destruction be our lot, Lincoln wrote in The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Now, of course, suicide is a dramatic word applied to the life of nations. It tends to describe not a single event, but a process. There is rarely an existential equivalent of Hamlet's bare bodkin that puts a sudden end to a sea of troubles for a nation. The diminutions are more protracted, and at the beginning anyway, less obvious. But my point is that those who live through a revolution, especially one that is largely pacific, generally cannot discern the radical changes that are taking place until it is nearly complete. Then they find to their chagrin that many of the assumptions, many of the basic assumptions about life, their place in the world, have changed utterly. How did it happen? Now, I believe that we are living through such a stealth revolution right now, today, November 2014. The chief issue at stake in this revolution is Burnham's great question: the relationship between the individual and the state. Today, that relationship is up for fundamental renegotiation in a way that is unprecedented, I think, in this country. How that negotiation concludes will determine many things about the way we live our lives, from the way we get our health care and educate our children, to the way in which we are allowed by our masters in Washington to conduct business, to the way the nation is constrained to conduct its foreign policy. James Burnham had a host of penetrating things to say about this question, and I'm delighted that we have three perspicacious commentators with us to reflect on this issue. I'm not sure why that called for laughter, but Burnham's son, James Burnham, Ronald Reagan's biographer, Stephen Hayward, and former editor of National Review, John O'Sullivan. Alphabetical order seemed the most compelling to us, so I think we'll start with Mr. Burnham. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger, and also thanks especially to the Buckley program at Yale. As you might imagine, for me, this is really a wonderful occasion in which we can sit down and discuss some of the ideas of my father and how they changed lives and changed policy at times, too. But I thought, since part of the program is the life of James Burnham, that I should really concentrate more on that than on the, at least this formal presentation part, and give you a couple of perspectives as growing up under James Burnham. What was it like? And believe it or not, my father's insistent on being realistic about how the world works was ingrained in all three Burnham children at a very, very early age. And I always remember one of the things when I was very young, he used to share with me, he'd show me a historical atlas. And he said, this is history here. The color advances, the color stabilizes from one page to the next, the color recedes, another color takes over parts of Africa or Europe or Asia. And he said, this is history right here, and this is the the historical ebb and flow of things, and you should recognize that this is going on all the time. And I think you can get a sense of that in Suicide of the West as well. So the historical atlas, which, as I say, he kept by his side most of the time, it was sort of the high priest of realism, I would argue, and that the historical atlas is a very useful Bible of sorts in doing that. And of course, it is insistent on orderly, logical thinking. Make sure that you just didn't go off on a toot without thinking what you were about to say. And like a lot of analysts, he had a penchant for lists. And the 39 propositions in Suicide of the West to determine whether or not you're a conservative or a liberal. Right? And then there are the 19 beliefs or ideas that make up the liberal syndrome. And so guess what? As a child, I also learned very early a list known as, to many of you probably familiar with it, sometimes it's called Burnham's laws or aphorisms. And these are really basic guidance on how to live by, whether you're a child or an adult or a politician for that matter. But it's clear you have to be at least over 21 years of age to accept them, in part at least, because the first one is the most important one he used to emphasize, and that is you should assume that everybody knows everything. And as a child, to think, that, where did you get that candy? Or some miscreants using a cell phone today. They still don't understand that. Everybody knows everything. And if you live with that aphorism in mind, it actually is a very cleansing, straightforward, and I would say moral way to live. The second law was he who says A must say B. In other words, you can't go back to go. You're out. You're launched. And another one that was especially difficult for children is just as good isn't. And if you're an investor, he had one too. And this may have been derived something perhaps from Canada Southern Petroleum forays at National Review at one point. But the law is you can't invest in retrospect. And then the one that all people should recognize, and politicians, it takes them so long to do this, wherever there is prohibition, there is a bootlegger. And then there's one that is very easy to generalize, but it refers to a very specific National Review situation with Willy Schlom, who was one of the other very early important editors, but he was a very difficult man to get along with, I gather, especially. And so in every project, there's always a Schlom. And number 7 was, you can't divorce yourself. You have to face it. Then number 8 is, every member must pay his dues. So you join up, you sign up for the dues. Number 9 was, no excuse, sir. Everybody should have that in their set of replies when they mess up. No excuse, sir. And the 10th one, which I love, is if there's no alternative, there's no problem. that is washed away. More useless thinking than I can think of. And finally, I would say that on these laws, the Suicide of the West has one, actually, which I think we should add and make it number 11. And as those of you who've read the book, there's a discussion of skid rows in Suicide of the West. And the bottom line is, quote, there will always be a skid row, which is sobering, but that's the way the analysis worked its way out. And as my father would say, that's the way it really is. Finally, my second point is he was not interested in economics very much. And it was always hard to get him into a good discussion of Milton Friedman or John Maynard Keynes or something like that. And I guess it even extended to when I was getting out of the Navy and as an officer and deciding to go to graduate school and get a doctorate in economics. And my father said, "Why don't you get a job?" Yeah, so my response to him was, "I'm going to get a union card." But it's sort of disinterest in economics, I thought it might have something to do with sort of residual Marxism, in the sense that the idea that economic policymakers are always just pawns or knights in the chess game involving business and government. Because like a lot of people, it was a very dim view of a lot of business people and the way they manipulated government and such. And so there was this sort of, outside of sort of macro managerial revolution concepts, but any of the sort of economic policy issues of the 70s, 60s, and 70s, he really had never really got very engaged in. So with that, let me turn it over to our second panelist here.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, this is a great honor to be here, and I want to thank the Buckley program for the kind invitation. This may sound like an odd way to begin, but sometimes James Burnham began in ways similar to this. When I think about his place in the intellectual firmament, I'm reminded of a television ad from a few years ago. Many of you will remember. The slogan was "An Army of One." Remember, that was the recruiting slogan from a few years ago. Well, Burnham, when you think about his place in the intellectual firmament of the post-war world, was a school of one. You know, he doesn't fit any of the usual categories. Jim just mentioned he wasn't a libertarian, he wasn't a traditionalist like Russell Kirk, he wasn't a fusionist like fellow National Review editor Frank Meyer. Certainly he wasn't a neoconservative, and his realism, I think it's a fair enough term, except that his realism is really quite distinct from the usual figures we think of as the arch realists like Kissinger and Morgenthau. I mean, even though they seem like hard-headed realists, they always conformed or yielded implicitly to the superficial conventional pieties of our time. And one thing about your dad is he never conformed to any of the superficial pieties of our time, right? Never by a single inch. And unlike Rand or Friedman or Hayek or Kirk or Strauss, or go down the pantheon, he founded no distinctive school of thought. He didn't have disciples or groupies, either stylistically or substantively. I think, by the way, Roger, you did him an insult. You didn't mean to by calling him a great political philosopher. That's way too low for him. That's really a way to insult a guy, right? He's a political thinker, which I think is of a higher and richer order. But there are no self-conscious, if I can try this ungainly word, Burnhamians in the world. Though I do think you can make out the influence of his thought in a number of people in a number of ways. And in fact, I'm going to present presently a Burnhamian analysis of our present moment in Washington. He was, for the most part, non-theoretical. That's the other thing that doesn't really make him a political philosopher. He didn't care much for political theory, unlike most sub-schools of political thought. The conservative movement, intellectual movement, tends to be dominated by theorists of various kinds. But you wouldn't quite call him a strict empiricist. He embraced empiricism, but two things mark him out. One is his prose certainly never resembled the dry and dusty and sometimes deathly dull prose of most social scientists. And more importantly, you always saw in all of his works how he incorporated what you might call synoptic long-wave views of history. He was always bringing out the long-term background of why a phenomenon that was in front of us was not something just for this season or even this decade, but something you could trace back 150, 200, 250 years, and something that would play out decades or centuries into the future. And that's part of what the Managerial Revolution, I think, brought to our attention. Burnham is often said to have evolved more than one of those gray moths beloved of evolutionary biologists, and I'm not quite sure that's quite correct. I mean, of course, he moved from left to right, from being a Trotskyite to a conservative, but I think you can make out an essential continuity or consistency in his method of thought or in his mind throughout all that. And most importantly, I mean, I think the one word that ought to be used is he was a prophet in many ways. He anticipated political trends and phenomena that have only come into focus in very recent years. So I think maybe one key to understanding Burnham in one short statement of his is The preface he wrote to the 1963 edition of the Machiavellians, that was his 1943 book, which was a study on how power is sought and the nature of political power in modern times. And in reissuing the book, he says, well, yes, I've changed my mind about a number of things, but I think this pretty much holds up. And then he closed with this, quote him here. Having come to know something of the gigantic ideology of Bolshevism, I knew I was not going to be able to settle for the pygmy ideologies of liberalism, social democracy, refurbished laissez-faire, or the inverted cut-rate Bolshevism called fascism. Through the Machiavellians, I began to understand more thoroughly what I had long felt, that only by renouncing all ideology can we begin to see the world and man. Well, I think you can make out what I'm calling a comprehensive Burnhamian view of the world from 4 books in this order of ascending importance for us. I think the Machiavellians already mentioned, and the Managerial Revolution has been mentioned, that was a description of the form political power would take in the modern world, what later came to be described as the new class in the 60s and 70s, and how this wasn't really an economic phenomenon at all. And then the suicide of the West, the sociological or pathological portrait of liberalism as a dysfunctional self-destructive family, or maybe even a tumor. But I think in some ways the most important book for our present moment, and by that I mean the week after this election we've just gone through, is a 1959 book of his that's tended to have been lost in the shuffle called Congress in the American Tradition. So think of the date, 1959, a book that sounds like, and much of it, as you get going into it, reads like a fairly traditional political science approach to the first branch of government. But before you get very far, and especially and explicitly toward the end, you realize the book is a sequel to the Managerial Revolution. In fact, it grows out of a single chapter from the Managerial Revolution that Burnham quotes extensively, goes back to that book at the end of the book. The chapter was Chapter 10, The Managers Shift the Locus of Sovereignty. And here I think is Burnham at his most theoretical, which is still not very theoretical, but he does embrace and draws upon the Lockean understanding that the founders embraced of legislative supremacy. But from there he triangulates with the Managerial Revolution and says, look, what's happening is that Congress, this is in 1959, is atrophying. It's losing its ability to operate as a political body like it should. So here's a quote from the Managerial Revolution that he brought back in the Congress book. See if this doesn't sound strikingly opposite to our current time. Again, a long quote, sorry, but you does it better than I can. Laws today in the United States, in fact, most laws, are not being made any longer by Congress, but by the NLRB, SEC, ICC, AAA, TVA, FTC, the Office of Production Management. What a revealing title, he says, with an exclamation point. And the other leading executive agencies, and he puts executive agencies in scare quotes. How well lawyers know this to be the case. To keep up with contemporary law, it is the rulings and records of these agencies that they have chiefly to study. How plainly it is reflected in the enormous growth of the executive branch of government, which is no longer simply executive, but legislative and judicial as well, in comparison with that of the other 2 branches. Indeed, most of the important laws passed by Congress in recent years have been laws to give up some more of its sovereign powers to one or another agency, largely outside of its control, end quote, voila. You have the perfect description of the Affordable Care Act or the Dodd-Frank law. Congress has said in 1,800 pages, let's not have any banks fail anymore. Over to you, all you agencies, to figure out how. Now, what is, again, distinctive about Burnham's appreciation of this phenomenon, which is now very widely perceived and talked about, is that he didn't reduce this, as our friends at the Federal Society like to do, to the decay of the non-delegation doctrine by the Supreme Court, or the decay or the breakdown of the separation of powers. He wrote in the book about how this really traces back, and it's happening everywhere, not just in the United States. I'll give you one more quote from the book that is useful, I think. Congress has let major policy decisions go by default to the unchecked will of the executive and the bureaucracy. The 22-pound million-itemed budget that is dropped annually into Congress's lap perfectly symbolizes the paralyzing effect of too many details. Since that kind of budget cannot be comprehended, it obviously cannot be effectively controlled. Congress keeps an illusory appearance of mastery in its own legislative house, but in reality loses control of basic decisions. Now, it was mentioned that Burnham often dissented from conservative orthodoxy. You know, he thought National Review was too harsh on Eisenhower. He thought the Goldwater nomination was foolhardy and that Rockefeller would actually be a better nominee for reasons that are defensible. And I think if he'd been around 3 or 4 years ago, he would have said, during all the ruckus over earmarks, he would have said that was actually a big mistake. I mean, of course, the reasons people erupted about earmarks are perfectly right. It really was an outrage that members of Congress would stick in an appropriation for the Dan Inouye Center for Goldfish Studies or whatever. But what Burnham would say is, no, actually what you want is more earmarks. You want Congress to really earmark the entire budget and really use the power of the purse and not just pass big appropriations for the bureaucrats to run wild with. He'd be quite against, and I think arguing against the conservative position on this. And I think, I don't want to go over time here, I think what he would say to us today is right now we're told, oh gosh, we have polarization and gridlock, and that's why we can't get anything done. And Congress is held in low esteem. What, 10% of Americans approve of Congress, down to staff and family, and we're not even too sure about staff, right? And what are the reformers saying? We need to abolish midterm elections. That's the big leading idea right now. And I can just imagine your dad having that wry smile that I've seen pictures of, saying, that will be exactly the reverse of what ought to happen. His book on Congress explains why the frequent elections were so important in the founders' understanding of having a mechanism to reflect changes in public opinion on a very frequent basis. And of course, that's against the interest of bureaucracies, if Congress will actually stand up and revitalize it. So I think what, in very shorthand, is Burnham, we're alive today, looking at where things stand, especially with a president who just last week openly embraced Woodrow Wilson's assault on the legislative branch by suggesting that he represents the people who didn't vote, who he presumed would vote for him, right? Which is amazing. Burnham talked about that. Burnham talked about that view in his book, talked about Wilson, said it actually originated with Grover Cleveland. It's sort of an amazing passage. He'd be saying right now we ought to be emphasizing revitalizing Congress. And it's not just something people can do, but that's a big subject, and I will stop there. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, Roger, fellow panelists, first of all, may I thank the Buckley program for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. Secondly, it's a slightly intimidating one because the very last time I was in this room, I was attacked physically by a gang of howling mob, really, of liberal intellectuals and postgraduate students, and they were trying to break in that door to get me, and we decided to exit by this one, so a spy in the audience shouted, "He's going out the other door," and we could hear them all running round the building to get me, and they did in fact get in, but I was rescued by 4 very solid Yale policemen who picked me up like a bag of groceries, rushed me through the crowd, and then flung me into the back of that car, the hired car, with the words to the driver, slammed the door and said to the driver, "Get out of here fast." Well, I have to say, it's the first time I've ever had to get out of town fast, and it remains a fond memory. And a proud moment, of course. Well, James Burnham devoted his life to understanding the Cold War and the longer age of totalitarianism that began in 1917 and ended in 1989, and to propounding a realistic strategy to defend the West and its freedoms. He had been, as we've heard, a leading theoretician in the American Trotskyist movement, but he broke with Marxism in all its varieties in 1940. In the book that best expounds his post-Trotskyist philosophy, The Machiavellians, he advances the view that popular government taken literally is an impossibility. Power is always wielded by an elite, and elites are in continual conflict to possess it. The slogans of popular government are little more than fraudulent devices by which one elite seeks mass support to overturn its predecessor. But once this harsh fact is faced, we can devise or retain social arrangements that are likely to increase popular welfare, insofar as an open society with several parties and a free press compels opposing elites to compete for the support of the majority of voters and to continue doing so in and out of government, the interests of the people will be served in some fashion. The modest benefits this will bring are greatly to be preferred to the extravagant promises of totalitarianism that in reality cloak slavery, lying, and mass murder. But we can't accept or gain these benefits unless we accept their underlying premise, and that is, only power can check power. Burnham applied these premises, insights rather, to international affairs in 4 books: The Managerial Revolution, The Struggle for the World, The Coming Defeat of Communism, and Containment or Liberation. His later book, which is the focus of this conference in the main, is an essay that in effect explains why liberalism doesn't understand these truths, indeed denies them, and therefore can't supply the West with a reliable means of resistance to its enemies. It is therefore, as Stephen Hayward has just suggested, highly topical at this moment. Now, The Managerial Revolution, Burnham's most famous book, which preceded the Machiavellians, bears the marks of Burnham's recent Marxism. It argues that economic forces are giving birth to a new form of planned society that is neither capitalist nor communist, but controlled by the managers, businessmen, bureaucrats, technicians, scientists, and so on. It will be centralized, collectivist, and inegalitarian. And the managerial class will rely on economic planning and bureaucratic politics rather than the free market and liberal institutions. This development was transforming, he said, international politics too. The world political system would shortly coalesce into 3 primary superstates, each based upon an area of advanced industry. The nuclei of these superstates would be Japan, Germany, and the United States. There would be future wars caused by the struggle among these 3 strategic centers for world control. Everywhere men would have to line up with one side or another in these superstates of tomorrow. Wars would continue to burst forth at intervals. Power would check power indefinitely. By the time that Burnham started to write The Struggle for the World 5 years later, 3 things had changed. Nazi Germany and militarist Japan had been comprehensively defeated. The Soviet Union had advanced into the heart of Europe, and the atomic bomb had been invented. Burnham therefore explicitly retracted his predictions of a new world order in the Managerial Revolution and sketched out a very different future in his new book, The Struggle for the World, which in my view is his most consequential and important book, although one can make different arguments. Since there were now only 2 superstates, he argued, the kind of power balancing that might have occurred with 3 had become impossible. One of these states, furthermore, might actually conquer the other, and therefore the world. The only 2 candidates for this world leadership were the Soviet Union and the United States. The USSR was the representative of communism, whose victory would reduce all society to the status of a subject colony in the West. Effective resistance could only be made by a non-communist world federation led and dominated by the United States. That would retain for itself the monopoly control of atomic weapons. In other words, there would have to be an American world empire, though one run on liberal lines in which lesser powers would retain a considerable measure of internal autonomy and dignity, and individual citizens would retain their liberty. In 1946, Burnham proposed 3 practical measures to achieve these things. First, the US should mount a friendly takeover of Britain and its empire by offering full constitutional union of the English-speaking countries. Second, there should be strong American encouragement of a European federation as a bulwark against Soviet communism. And third, the US should adopt a comprehensive program to rally world opinion, which would include appealing to the Soviet peoples, the victims of communism, and its fiercest opponents over the heads of their government. When you look at those 3 things, you have to be struck by the degree to which they are similar, almost identical, to the contents of Winston Churchill's Fulton speech delivered 1 year later. Indeed, Christopher Hitchens argued that Churchill had actually been influenced by Burnham's book, and I tried to find out whether this was the case, but I haven't been able to. Someone in the audience may know that. But whether or not it was a case of Burnham influencing Churchill over Fulton, or whether it was a case of simultaneity in which 2 clever people arrive at the same proposal independently, it is very striking. So within a matter of 6 years, Burnham had produced 2 original, analytical, and apparently contradictory exercises in what we now call futurology. Such sweeping strokes on such a vast historical canvas were an invitation to criticism. His most acute critic was his most brilliant imitator, George Orwell, who based his 1984 with its 3 competing superstates of East Asia, Eurasia and Oceania perpetually at war with each other upon the geopolitical vision of the Managerial Revolution. Indeed, Burnham's book appears in Orwell's novel as The Theory of Oligarchical Collectivism. Quite a good title, actually. in two long essays, Second Thoughts on James Burnham and Burnham's View of the Contemporary World Struggle, Orwell subjected, however, the Burnhamite theses to an analysis that was respectful, harsh, shrewd, and in my view, ultimately mistaken. Orwell was right to point out that there were some possibilities in the situation of 1946-47 that Burnham failed to explore. Two of them, mentioned by Orwell, were that atomic weapons would prove too frightening to use, and that given a generation or so of peace, Soviet politics would develop in the direction of greater freedom. Both those prophecies have been partly borne out by events, but it has to be said that Reagan's policies were a major factor in the final evolution and collapse of communism, and those policies followed Burnham's prescriptions rather than Orwell's. Indeed, Orwell's sole policy prescription in this criticism was to set against Burnham's proposal for an American empire a socialist United States of Europe that would rob communism of its political appeal by offering economic security without concentration camps. That, of course, is an admirable idea, but as a political proposal, it is frivolous. Orwell himself admitted that it would take 20 years of peace to bring it about, yet any policy at the time, we're talking about 46, would have to be directed, as Burnham's was, to securing the 20 years of peace that Orwell's alternative policy required. On top of that, a proposal for European socialism was a distraction, an absurd distraction, at a time when a prostrate Europe was living on loans from capitalist America. And finally, it would have created bitter political divisions at the very time when anti-Soviet unity was what was most needed. Alongside Burnham's sharp-eyed realpolitik, and there I agree with Stephen, it was little more than partisan daydreaming. Orwell's second criticism was a very famous one, namely that at each point, Burnham is predicting a continuation of the thing that is happening. Now, the tendency to do this, says Orwell, is a major mental disease, and its roots lie partly in cowardice and partly in the worship of power, which is not fully separable from cowardice. Now, the best answer to this criticism is the struggle for the world, which amounts to a program to reverse the thing that was happening at the time, namely the advance of Soviet Russia. Nothing in Burnham's career hints at that kind of moral cowardice or intellectual, and in later life, as a senior editor of National Review, he took what was plainly the less influential side in the liberal conservative struggle. But the string of false short-term predictions in the Managerial Revolution does require explanation, and by a nice incongruity, it is Orwell who provides it. Only 2 months before he published Second Thoughts on James Burnham, Orwell wrote a letter in which he delivered this judgment. Whether we like it or not, the trend is towards centralism and planning, and it is more useful to try to humanize the collective society that is certainly coming than to pretend, like Colm-Brogan, that we could revert to a past phase. Colm-Brogan later was the London editor of National Review. Orwell, however, Orwell is here guilty of what he accuses Burnham, or seems to be. But I think both men can easily be acquitted of charges of cowardice and power worship. So what did they have in common that led them both into thinking collectivism was inevitable into some rubric or another at that time? And I reach a conclusion rather similar to Stephen Hayward's. Surely the answer is that both men, as socialists, and as Mr. Burnham, had been economic determinists. Orwell remained a curious kind of cranky, unsystematic British socialist until his death, while Burnham evolved into a curious kind of American conservative. But for a long time, he retained his Marxist contempt for American business, especially in relation to foreign policy, where I think it was often deserved. And as late as the late 40s, he underestimated the flexibility of the free market, arguing that Europe will never recover. I quote, "Europe will never recover," because Stalin had cut off its natural markets in the East. At that time, Europe was, in fact, recovering very rapidly. More important, his economic determinism led him into a serious intellectual error, at least as I would feel it. the belief that political sovereignty must coincide with economic efficiencies of scale. Burnham's 3 superstates were required, and organized managerial societies like Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia were likely to prevail because modern industry needed larger markets to exploit and larger capital markets on which to draw, and these would have to be larger than the crabbed nation-states of Europe could provide. The errors here are to assume that centralized economic planning and industrial interventionism are necessary attributes of political sovereignty, and that larger markets can only be achieved in the framework of larger states. In fact, it is not only possible, but desirable to combine economic integration with political decentralization. That, after all, is the promise of American federalism. And almost 2 centuries before Burnham, Adam Smith wrote, I quote, "Were all nations to follow the liberal system of free exportation and free importation, the different states into which a great continent was divided would so far resemble the different provinces of a great empire." The general application of free trade rules under GATT would later achieve almost all that Burnham thought necessary without requiring his new order of superstates. And the general direction of affairs would continue to be much more responsive to popular sentiment and critical debate in sovereign nation-states than under the rule of remote bureaucracies in his vast superstates. Burnham's criticisms of Soviet society suggest that he had grasped this by the middle 1950s. That brings us to Orwell's 3rd and most telling criticism. This is that Burnham makes mistakes because he is too fond of apocalyptic visions, too ready to believe that the modeled processes of history will happen suddenly and logically. Now, there's some truth in this criticism, but when examined, it turns out to be a matter of style and timing rather than that of error. Burnham, a philosopher by training, wrote with great clarity. He pared away the superficialities of any situation to go to its central point. He would occasionally point out that history, in going from A to B, would take a meandering course, but he was concerned with its ultimate destination, rather than back with the wayside inns. So his arguments occasionally and predictions take on a sharpness that exiles his qualifications to the fine print. But the fact is that at that time, history was showing that it was a series of really quite apocalyptic events, beginning with 1917 and ending at this point with the Berlin airlift. Burnham could surely be forgiven for slipping occasionally into apocalyptic style when apocalypses were occurring almost annually. None of which should blind us to the fact that Burnham's predictions were generally borne out, if with some delay, and that his advice was often followed, if in a more muddled way than he would have suggested. His advocacy of a constitutional merger between the US and Britain was not, of course, followed to the letter, but the post-war world saw a unique Anglo-American cooperation in intelligence, in nuclear policy, and in foreign policy that went beyond other alliance politics in NATO. The European Federation he proposed does not yet exist, but within 3 years of his proposal, the European Coal and Steel Community was founded, and 5 years after that, the Treaty of Rome established the European Economic Community, which may yet implement his advice in full. No American statesman would claim to establish a world empire, but NATO was established only 2 years after Burnham wrote, and the imposition of American wishes on reluctant allies at Suez and in the Katanga affair reveals, in the clear light of a crunch, the US enjoyed a power over its allies that fell only a little short of imperial. Why did Burnham receive so little credit for this prescience? The reason may have been that on the great topic of the day, namely on how to resist communism, he was felt to be too confident of success and too aggressive in his strategic proposals. This public impression was unjustified. His choice of title, The Coming Defeat of Communism, did not accurately describe the more measured spirit of his book, and Sidney Hook begged him to change it for that very reason. But it was the title that most people remembered, and its promise was not to be fulfilled for 40 years, 2 years after Burnham died. In the meantime, Burnham could give any number of answers to critics who asserted that he had been proved wrong, beginning with read the book. The Soviet-American nuclear duopoly, and later the spread of nuclear weapons to Britain, France, China, and so on, which he had warned against in the struggle for the world, imposed a restraint on American actions and a slowness of change in international affairs that together helped the Soviet empire to survive. The inability of liberalism to resist or even often to notice hostile tyrannies, provided they spoke the language of progress and human rights, which he diagnosed in the book we're discussing today, The Suicide of the West, led to fatal hesitation again and again by Western policymakers in the face of either challenges or opportunities. And the embodiment of this hesitation in the policy of containment, which he analyzed in Containment or Liberation, produced a long-term tendency to appeasement and retreat. In short, he could repeat what was the actual argument of the coming defeat of communism, that communism would be defeated in a surprisingly short time if his advice was followed, but not otherwise. And his advice for most of the post-war world was not followed. So his public reputation and his visibility suffered nonetheless. And when he refused to join the liberal jihad against Joe McCarthy in the 50s, Burnham found himself excluded from the Vicarage Tea Party of respectable intellectuals. As Philip Rav of Partisan Review remarked to William Barrett, who records this in his book, The Truants, the liberals now dominate all the cultural channels in the country. If you break completely with this dominant atmosphere, you're a dead duck. James Burnham has committed suicide. Well, that was true. Like Lazarus, however, he was raised from the dead. No other comparison is implied here, but he was raised from the dead by William F. Buckley. He became an editor of National Review, and the principal influence on Buckley, as both my predecessors have mentioned, as Bill very straightforwardly said, in the position he had, he exerted powerful influence, directly and indirectly, upon the rising new conservatism of Ronald Reagan, and especially on its foreign policy. Reagan's prosecution of the Cold War owed an enormous amount to Burnham's writings and thoughts, which is reflected in the president giving him the award. If George Orwell, a generous-minded man, had lived until 1989, or even until 1986 or so, it is hard to imagine he would not have accepted that his great adversary had, in the end, got the better of their historic argument. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we don't have an abundance of time, but I'd like to first ask the panelists if they have anything they would like to add by way of observation, animadversion, criticism, comment.
Just, my father used to discuss his books with him occasionally in short form, and I know the Managerial Revolution he always considered a sort of midstream ideological book. It's very clearly on the road from Marxism, Trotskyism, and to what you might call a more freedom-looking view of how politics at least should operate. Also, I think he also considered, and indeed it was in print for a long, long time, the Machiavellians is really the apparatus that he uses to analyze problems of whatever age. And the Machiavellians is simply a series of essays on earlier political scientists, starting with Machiavelli, but Pareto, Sorel, and others. And he was just trying to say this is sort of this realism school of political analysis, and it's the only one that really holds up over time. And so I just make those sort of two comments about those two books.
I think the struggle for the world holds up. And I think one of the dramatic things, I remember reading it as a student, and I think the first chapter is what we should do. And it's a very short chapter, and it says, well, we should let the Russians win. We should abandon all attempts we should ask what would the great philosophers, Christ, Buddha, and others have recommended. They would have recommended submission. It is better to accept an evil than to perpetrate one, and accept we would be ruled by a hostile force until eventually it's softened in some way. And by the way, some people in Europe, very serious people in Central Europe, did in fact recommend such a policy. I mean, there's a Hungarian who in the 1940s, when he sees what's happening, says the best thing we can do is pretend to ally with the Russians and hope that we'll be ruled in a more friendly and indulgent way, and eventually they'll lose. Then he ends this chapter, by the way, Burnham ends this chapter by saying, well, we're not going to do that, of course. So what do we then have to do? But it's a really gripping opening because it takes you in the wrong direction for about 3 or 4 pages.
Well, I'll add a quick comment since I don't see anybody at the microphone yet, but it's like students never want to ask the first question, right? You professors know that. If anything, John, I think you understate the extent to which Reagan's endgame on the Cold War emerges from Burnham's. I mean, you laid it out fairly well, but I mean, you could say more about that. I think the one document that comes to mind is not so much the speeches that were so famous, but the key document, I think it's one of the sort of 5 key documents of the Cold War, was the NSDD 72, I think that's the right number, from 1982. That's the one that's 6 or 7 pages. Says, this is our strategy for the Cold War. And it says we're going to start an ideological fight. We're going to do all these things that really sound like what Burnham was saying in the 40s ought to be done. But as you say, the country, the world wasn't ready for that. And by the way, the last paragraph of that memo, you can find it online. I write about it in my book a lot. They say, essentially, I'll summarize it this way, there's going to be hell to pay for doing this. The actual language is, we're going to get a lot of criticism from our allies, from the media, from our political opponents at home. I think the actual line is, we'll be pressured to adopt more, quote-unquote, normal attitudes like we had during the years of détente, things of that kind. So we're going to have a lot of fortitude to see this through. That sounds very much like something Burnham would have said. So.
Yes, I'll just observe what John was saying about Burnham's little thought experiment. Maybe we should just give in to the Russians. I actually had a professor at this university who proposed that quite seriously, but we'll leave that for another day. Is there any questions? Are there microphones that go around? Or yeah.
I'd like to ask the panelists why they think the realistic, freedom-loving perspectives of folks like Mr. Burnham are so lacking in stickiness, and we seem to repeating the mistakes of forgetting them over and over. And I ask that in the context of, we have an administration that's about to hand the nuclear keys to the Middle East to the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is a terrifying thought. And what accounts for our inability to get those lessons down in the face of so much evidence?
I think we'll take a first stab at that. I think to a very large extent, conservative intellectuals and a lot of the activist class too are, believe it or not, they have a large streak of residual idealism, or that sort of dominates their first approach to political questions. And that explains the conservatives' reverence for the American founders, right? And so, even though, James Burnham would say, look what a realist Madison was, which is absolutely right. But I actually think it's almost that simple, because most conservatives say, well, I'm pretty realistic, and that's true also. But I think Burnham is absolutely without illusions, without any sentimental idealism in the way it usually comes to sight. I think that's why. It's just unfamiliar to so many people. We just resist thinking that coldly about things.
I think Burnham explains this himself in the Machiavellians, which I agree is, I think that's the kind of central book of his thought, and the other books are emanations in a way. But he's describing Pareto's distinction between, and I can never remember the terms, but one is means a settled disposition of people, desires, passions, you might say, and the other are rationalizations of these things. But the rationalizations change all the time, but the desires remain fairly constant. Does anyone remember the terms? Pareto, he's drawing on Pareto. It's substitute. No, it's not. I can't remember. Sorry, but the point, however, is that there is permanent disposition, which you've just called idealism, Stephen, but which certainly exists, and it recurs again and again. And you have to, and events, it seems to me, it's not just arguments, it's events have to confirm Burnham's analysis before people then begin to take it seriously.
Of course, the Suicide of the West has a discussion about guilt and how guilt motivates much of liberalism, and in one sense that liberalism replaces Christianity, in a sense that, as he writes, he says, that Christianity resolved the guilt problem for individuals if they were truly professed Christians, which is sort of a rather interesting aspect of the book, I think. But just simply emphasizes how, if you feel guilty about things, then you want to help, you want to do something. It doesn't matter what you do, as long as you're doing something that is intended to help people, and that helps yourself a great deal and assuages the guilt that you may feel about your relatively better off position.
Are there other questions or comments? I declare this adjourned. Thank you.